They called her a fool for buying a forgotten orchard. And in the town of Amity Hollow, Kansas, in the autumn of 1887, that was very nearly the kindest thing anyone said about Josephine Calder, who was 40 years old, newly widowed, and standing at a county tax auction with $4.60 to her name
40?
after her husband's
She
cousin,
cannot pay for
a smooth-tongued
What a
land
total
agent named
waste of
Horace
time.
Pruitt, had produced a lien
Everything
against
is
her
in order,
homestead
Sheriff.
that she had
The
never
property now
signed and
reverts
could
to the
never
estate.
disprove
It is a valid order,
and had.
Josephine.
Watched the sheriff's
truly
men
sorry.
carry her furniture into the road while he stood by looking almost sorry about it. With what little she had left, Josephine walked 3 miles past the edge of town to where the county was clearing its unpaid parcels. And there, for the sum of $7 she did not entirely have and had to beg an extension to pay, she bought 20 acres of dead, tangled apple trees known to everyone in Amity Hollow as the Old Halloway Orchard, a place so thoroughly given up on that even the crows seemed to pass over it. It was, by any sensible measure, a fool's purchase, dead land bought with borrowed pride. But sunk deep beneath the orchard's collapsed old well, sealed against 30 years of rain and silence, was a truth that would clear a dead man's name, undo a family's long theft, and give the whole starving town something it had been quietly hungry for since long before Josephine Calder ever arrived.
We
Settle
finally
in,
did it.
and let us tell you the
A
story
new
of
beginning
Josephine
for all
Calder.
of us.
If you have ever stood on ground everyone else called ruined and felt, against all good sense, that it still had something left to give, tell us in the comments, because this is a story for you. Josephine had not been raised among orchards at all, but among gardens, in the household of her Aunt Prudence, a widow of considerable stubbornness who had taken in her orphan niece in a small river town in Ohio and taught her, over the better part of 2 decades, the quiet and demanding discipline of growing things back from ruin. Prudence Ashby had a particular gift, spoken of with a certain wary respect by the town's other gardeners, for taking on trees and vines that everyone else had already condemned to the woodpile. A peach tree blighted black and dropping its fruit before ripening, a grapevine strangled by its own untended growth, a rose bed gone entirely to thorn and weed, and coaxing them, through patient grafting and careful pruning and a kind of watchfulness that bordered on tenderness, into bearing again. Anything living wants one more chance before it dies, Prudence used to say, kneeling in the dirt with her shears in hand while young Josephine held the basket. And most folks give up on a thing exactly 1 season too soon. Your job, if you want to be any good at this, is to learn to tell the difference between a thing that's finished and a thing that's only resting. She taught Josephine to read a tree the way other women read a face, the color of the bark near the graft line, the give of a branch when bent, the particular smell of healthy roots against rotted ones. And she taught her, too, the deeper and more patient art of grafting itself, the careful marrying of a dying rootstock to new living wood, a skill that required a steadiness of hand and a willingness to wait a full season or more before knowing whether the work had taken at all. It was not only trees that Prudence taught her niece to read patiently. Prudence had buried 2 husbands and outlived a good deal of other people's gossip about how a woman managed to keep a house and a garden and her own good name without a man's help for so long. And she had developed, over the years, an unhurried skepticism toward any story the town told too quickly and too unanimously about a person who could no longer speak for themselves. The loudest story about a dead man, she told Josephine once, watching the neighbor women whisper about a farmer who had died owing debts he swore, before his death, he had never taken on, is usually the one that's most convenient for whoever's left standing to collect from him. Josephine had absorbed this the way she absorbed everything from her aunt, without fully understanding, at the time, how much she would one day need it. She married at 26, later than most women of her acquaintance, to a homesteader named Daniel Calder who had come through Ohio buying grafted saplings for the orchard he meant to plant on his claim out in Kansas, and who had been so taken with the quiet, competent young woman selling him trees that he had returned twice more before working up the nerve to ask whether she might consider planting her life alongside his instead. Josephine had said yes with a certainty that surprised even her, and the 2 of them had traveled west together to Amity Hollow, where Daniel's claim sat on good bottomland along a shallow creek, and where Josephine spent the first years of her marriage doing exactly what her aunt had trained her for her whole life to do, grafting hardy rootstock with good fruiting wood, nursing along the young trees Daniel had carried west in damp burlap, learning the particular temperament of Kansas soil and Kansas weather, and slowly building, tree by patient tree, an orchard of their own that by their 10th year together had become one of the more reliable sources of good fruit in that stretch of the county. They had no children, a private sorrow Josephine rarely spoke of even to herself, but she had come to feel that the orchard itself was something like a family, each tree a small, ongoing labor of patience and hope, and she had come to know, in her bones, the particular satisfaction of watching something everyone else might have dismissed as too much trouble reward that trouble handsomely, given enough seasons. What she carried forward from all those years with her aunt, and then with Daniel, more than any specific skill with a grafting knife, was Prudence's old conviction, tested and confirmed 100 times over in the patient work of nursing sick trees back to bearing, that a thing pronounced finished by people in a hurry was very often only resting, waiting for someone patient enough to look closely and tend it properly, and that the story everyone repeated most confidently about why a thing had failed was worth examining just as carefully as the thing itself. She did not know, in those quietly contented years beside her own small orchard, how soon and how thoroughly she would need both lessons, or how completely they would one day be the only inheritance left to her. The fall began, as these things so often do, with an illness that seemed at first no worse than any other hard winter's fever. Daniel took sick in the January of 1887, a lung complaint that the town's aging doctor treated as best he knew how, and though he seemed for a time to be mending, the fever returned harder in February and took him within the week, leaving Josephine a widow at 40 with a modest but genuinely valuable homestead, a flourishing young orchard, and, she believed, a clear title to both. She had not counted on Horace Pruitt. Horace was Daniel's cousin on his mother's side, a man who had drifted into Amity Hollow some years earlier and made himself useful as a land agent, an informal moneylender to homesteaders needing a bridge loan between harvests, building over time a reputation for fair dealing that Josephine, grieving and unsuspecting, had no particular reason to question. Within 2 months of Daniel's death, Horace appeared at her door with a county clerk and a document, dated 3 years earlier, purporting to record a loan Daniel had taken against the homestead to cover a bad season, a loan Josephine had never once heard mentioned in 10 years of keeping their household accounts together, bearing a signature that resembled her husband's closely enough to satisfy a clerk in a hurry, but not closely enough, she was certain, to satisfy anyone who had watched Daniel sign his name across a decade of ledgers as she had. She said as much, plainly and repeatedly, to anyone who would listen, but a grieving widow's certainty, she discovered with a bitterness that never entirely left her, carries very little weight against a respected land agent's paperwork and a county clerk's rubber stamp. The circuit judge, sympathetic but unmoved by anything beyond the documents in front of him, ruled the lien valid, and gave Josephine 90 days to satisfy the debt or surrender the property. She spent those 90 days doing everything her aunt's old skepticism told her to do. She wrote to the bank in the county seat where Daniel had once kept a small account, asking whether any record existed there of such a loan, and received a reply stating only that the bank had no dealings with Mr. Pruitt's private lending and could offer no information either way. She asked the handful of neighbors who had known Daniel well whether he had ever mentioned such a debt, and found only uneasy shrugs, for Horace Pruitt was known to be a man best not crossed over a private business matter. She searched every trunk and drawer in the house for some scrap of paper, some old account book, that might contradict the loan document, and found nothing, because whatever else might be said of Horace Pruitt's forgery, it had been made with enough care to leave no obvious seam for an ordinary search to catch. On the 89th day, having exhausted every avenue she could think of, Josephine packed what little she could carry, her aunt's old grafting knife, a small bundle of clothing, and $4.60 she had managed to set aside from selling what furniture the sheriff's men allowed her to keep, and walked away from the orchard she and Daniel had spent 10 years building, understanding with a grief that had nothing gentle in it that she was now, at 40, entirely without home, husband, or income, in a county where the man who had taken everything from her was widely regarded as an upstanding citizen. She might have left Amity Hollow entirely, and she considered it seriously for the better part of a week, staying in a spare room the town's aging doctor's widow offered her out of simple charity. But it was during that week, hearing the doctor's widow mention almost in passing that the county was clearing its books of long unpaid parcels before the new year, including 20 acres out past the North Creek crossing that everyone still called the Old Halloway Orchard, though no Halloway had lived there in 30 years, that something in Josephine, some stubborn remnant of her aunt's old conviction that a thing given up on was often only resting, refused to simply leave. The orchard, when she walked out to see it, was in a state that would have discouraged a less patient woman entirely. 20 acres of apple and pear trees, planted with real care by someone who had understood the work, stood now choked with 3 decades of unchecked growth, deadwood tangled through living branches, the ground beneath thick with brush, and the collapsed remains of what had once been a modest farmhouse. But Josephine, walking the rows with the same careful attention her aunt had taught her to bring to any dying tree, saw past the ruin to something the county auctioneer plainly had not: old rootstock, in many of the trees, that was still sound beneath the neglect, grafts that had taken cleanly decades ago and simply needed the deadwood cleared away to breathe again. When the auction was held that following week, a small, poorly attended affair since no one in the county considered the Halloway orchard worth the trouble of clearing, the bidding opened and closed at $6 with no other interest at all, and Josephine, with a boldness that surprised the auctioneer more than it surprised her, said 7, and paid what she had and promised the rest within the month, and became, to the quiet amusement of the handful of men present, the new owner of 20 acres that everyone in Amity Hollow agreed were fit for nothing but firewood. She moved into the collapsed farmhouse's least ruined room within days, patching what she could with materials scavenged from the property itself, and began the slow work of clearing the orchard the way her aunt had taught her to approach any overgrown planting. Not all at once, in a hurry, but tree by tree, row by row, cutting away the deadwood and assessing what living growth remained beneath it. It was in the 3rd week of this work, clearing brush from around what had once clearly been a well at the orchard's center, its stone rim collapsed and half swallowed by blackberry bramble, that Josephine first noticed something that struck her, in the same way a wrongly tensioned stitch might have struck her aunt. The well's collapse looked, on close inspection, less like 30 years of natural decay and more like something that had been deliberately caved in, the stones at its rim not tumbled outward as gravity and time would have scattered them, but pulled inward and packed down with what looked like old timber bracing, as though someone had once gone to considerable trouble to seal the well shut rather than simply let it fall to ruin on its own. Her aunt's voice returned to her then, as it so often did at odd moments. A thing given up on all at once, in a hurry, is worth a second look, because most folks quit a season too soon. Josephine spent the better part of 2 days working the collapsed stones and packed earth loose from the well's mouth, her hands blistered and her back aching in a way she had not felt since the hardest seasons of grafting alongside Daniel. And on the 2nd evening, with the light nearly gone, her shovel struck something that was neither stone nor root: a tin box, rusted through in places but largely intact, wedged into a shelf someone had cut into the well's stone lining a good 6 feet below where the original water line would have sat, well above any flooding the well itself might once have seen, placed with obvious deliberate care rather than simply dropped or lost. She carried the box back to the farmhouse and sat with it a long while before she found the nerve to force its rusted latch, aware in some instinctive way that she was about to open something that had waited a very long time for exactly this kind of patient attention. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle but still largely protective, she found a thick, carefully kept ledger, several folded letters, and a small velvet pouch that, when she loosened its drawstring, spilled out perhaps $30 in old gold coin, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to the woman kneeling on that farmhouse floor with $4.60 recently spent down to almost nothing. The ledger's first page bore a name in careful, practiced handwriting: Elijah Halloway, and beneath it, the words Cooperative Harvest Fund, Amity Hollow, begun this year of our Lord 1854. Josephine, who had heard the name Halloway spoken around town only ever as a kind of cautionary footnote, the man who built the old orchard, then disappeared under a cloud some 30 years back, Best not to ask too much about it. Read on through the ledger's careful entries by lamplight long into the night, and began to understand that she had found something considerably larger than an old farmer's account book. Elijah Halloway, the ledger and the accompanying letters made clear over the following days of careful reading, had been a freedman who arrived in the Kansas Territory in the early 1850s with almost nothing beyond a considerable skill for orchard husbandry learned, the letters suggested, from years of managing fruit trees on a plantation before his own freedom, and a determination to build something lasting on land where, for the first time in his life, that determination might actually be allowed to bear fruit. He had planted the orchard Josephine now owned with his own hands, and more than that, he had organized, among the handful of small farmers scattered around what would become Amity Hollow, a genuinely remarkable cooperative arrangement, a shared fund into which each farmer contributed a small portion of their harvest proceeds, administered by Halloway with meticulous care, meant to provide seed money for new settlers, relief for families hit by drought or illness, and eventually, as the fund grew, the capital to build the town's first proper grain mill and irrigation channel from the creek, improvements no single homesteader could afford alone, but that would benefit every farm in the valley. The ledger recorded, in Halloway's own careful hand, more than a decade of faithful contributions and disbursements, a genuine and thriving cooperative built from nothing but trust and patient administration. And then, in the final third of the ledger, the entries grew shorter, more clipped, plainly written under some strain. In the autumn of 1856, Halloway recorded, the fund's considerable accumulated savings, nearly $600, an enormous sum for that time and place, had been placed for safekeeping at the insistence of the town's most prominent citizen, a banker and founding land speculator named Cornelius Pruitt, in a strongbox kept at Pruitt's own home, since Amity Hollow as yet had no proper bank vault to secure such a sum. Within a year, the fund's balance, according to Pruitt's own accounting, had somehow dwindled to less than $100, attributed to a series of loans Pruitt claimed the fund's own committee had approved to cover his land speculation ventures, loans Halloway's careful private notes made clear he had never voted for and did not believe had ever been properly authorized by anyone. When Halloway pressed the matter publicly, Cornelius Pruitt had responded, according to Halloway's own bitter final entries, by accusing Halloway himself of having skimmed the missing funds over the years, a charge that gained immediate and nearly unanimous traction in a town where a white banker's word against a black orchardist was, in that time and place, no contest at all. Halloway had been driven out within the season, his orchard left to founder, his name attached ever after to a theft Cornelius Pruitt himself had committed, and Josephine understood, reading the final letter tucked into the ledger's back pages, addressed to no one in particular, but plainly meant to be found someday, that Halloway had buried his true accounts and what little coin he had managed to recover before fleeing, trusting that the ground itself would keep his honesty safe longer than the town had been willing to. Josephine sat with that final letter for a long while and thought of her aunt kneeling in the dirt decades earlier. The loudest story about a person who can no longer speak for themselves is usually the one that's most convenient for whoever's left standing to collect from him. Cornelius Pruitt had told the loudest story about Elijah Halloway for 30 years, and the town had believed it because believing it cost them nothing and suited the man who told it. And Josephine understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, why the name Pruitt had struck her as familiar the very first time Horace introduced himself as Daniel's cousin. For Horace, she now confirmed through a careful conversation with the doctors, widow, was Cornelius Pruitt's own grandson, having inherited both his family's respected standing in Amity Hollow and, evidently, a certain talent for producing documents that served his interests rather better than the truth did. She did not act rashly, for the ledger's full implications took considerable time to work through fully, and Josephine understood, from her own recent and bitter experience, exactly how little a plain accusation would accomplish against a family as established as the Pruitts. She spent the following weeks doing quiet, careful work, cross-referencing Halloway's ledger entries against whatever land records and old county documents she could access at the courthouse, tracing the pattern of land purchases Cornelius Pruitt had made in the years immediately following the fund's mysterious depletion, purchases that, laid alongside Halloway's dates and figures, formed an unmistakable picture of a man who had used a cooperative fund built by his poorest neighbors as private capital to buy up the very land those same neighbors would later need. She learned, too, through careful and delicate inquiry, that Elijah Halloway had a granddaughter, a schoolteacher named Delia Halloway Marsh living in a town 2 counties over, who had grown up hearing only the family's own private insistence that her grandfather had been innocent of whatever he was accused of, without ever knowing the particulars strong enough to clear his name publicly. It was not long before Horace Pruitt learned that the widow he had evicted was now living on the old Halloway place and asking pointed questions at the courthouse about his grandfather's old land dealings, and his response, when it came, carried none of the smooth regret he had shown at Josephine's original eviction. He arrived at the orchard himself, on a fine afternoon in early autumn, with an offer to buy the 20 acres back from her at 3 times what she had paid, framed as a neighborly gesture toward a widow struggling with land too much for her to manage alone, though Josephine, who had spent 10 years reading her aunt's careful lessons about convenient stories, recognized the offer immediately for what it was. When she declined, politely but without hesitation, his tone shifted with a speed that confirmed everything the ledger had already told her. He reminded her, with a coldness that had not been present at their first meeting, that her title to the orchard rested on a county tax sale that could, he suggested, be challenged on any number of technical grounds if she proved unreasonable, and that a woman alone, already once found on the wrong side of a legal judgment, would find few friends in amity. Hollow willing to stand against the Pruitt name a second time. The weeks that followed tested Josephine in ways the original eviction, for all its cruelty, had not quite managed to. A rumor began moving through town that the widow at the old Halloway place had been discovered removing county property, an accusation vague enough to trouble the sheriff without ever quite resolving into a formal charge. 2 of the few neighbors who had shown her early kindness grew suddenly distant, having businesses or debts that made them reluctant to be seen taking sides against a Pruitt. And Josephine, working alone in an orchard everyone had already decided was worthless, felt for a time the particular isolation of a woman who has found the truth and discovered that finding it changes nothing at all unless someone besides herself is willing to look at it too. But she had, after all, spent her whole life learning that a tree given up on a season too soon could still, with patient tending, be coaxed back to bearing, and she applied that same unhurried patience now to the work of building a case that could not simply be waved away by a confident denial. She wrote first and most carefully to Delia Halloway Marsh, sending copies of her grandfather's ledger entries and letters, and received, in return, not only a grateful, tearful reply, but a bundle of the family's own preserved correspondence from the year of Elijah's exile, letters that corroborated the ledger's account from the other direction and gave Josephine a second, independent thread of evidence. She approached, next, the editor of the county's small weekly newspaper, a man with no particular loyalty to the Pruitt family and a professional appetite for a genuinely remarkable story, who agreed to examine the ledger and the land records himself before committing to print anything, and who came away, after several days of careful review, convinced enough of the pattern to begin asking his own pointed questions at the courthouse. And she sought out, finally, the handful of older farming families in the valley whose own forebears had contributed to Halloway's original cooperative fund, families who, once shown the actual figures in Halloway's own careful hand, began to recall, with the particular clarity that comes when a suspicion long buried is finally given permission to surface, their own grandparents' old, unspoken doubts about how quickly the Pruitt fortune had grown in those same years. The newspaper's story, when it finally ran under a headline about a buried ledger and a 30-year-old injustice, could not be dismissed the way Horace Pruitt plainly hoped it would be, for it arrived supported not by one widow's word alone, but by Halloway's own decade of careful record-keeping, by his granddaughter's independent family letters, and by land records any citizen could examine for themselves at the courthouse. The county's land office, its interest sharpened considerably by public attention and by several of the valley's older families now openly questioning old Pruitt land titles, opened a formal review of Cornelius Pruitt's original purchases, and though Cornelius himself had been dead for over a decade and could face no accounting of his own, the review concluded that a substantial portion of the Pruitt family's holdings had indeed been financed through funds misappropriated from Holloway's cooperative, a finding that carried, if not full legal restitution after so many years, then certainly the complete public collapse of the Pruitt family's long unquestioned standing in Amity Hollow. Horace Pruitt, whose own forged lien against Josephine's homestead came under fresh scrutiny once the newspaper's inquiries turned toward the family's general habit of convenient paperwork, found his private lending business abruptly, without customers, as neighbor after neighbor recalled some old, uneasy detail about a loan or a lien that had never quite sat right. And within the year, he had quietly left Amity Hollow altogether rather than face a formal challenge to the very document that had once cost Josephine her home. Josephine herself asked for no restitution beyond the return of her original homestead, which the county, faced with the mounting evidence against Horace's lien, restored to her without further argument. But she did not stop there. Working alongside Delia Holloway Marsh and the small circle of old farming families who had once quietly benefited from Elijah Holloway's cooperative fund, she helped establish, using a portion of the gold coins still remaining in the old tin box along with fresh contributions from families now eager to make right what their own grandparents had allowed to happen, a revived version of the very cooperative Holloway had built decades before, a shared fund for the valley's farmers, meant exactly as this had been to help families through drought and illness and hard seasons, administered this time by a proper committee with public accounts that anyone in Amity Hollow could examine at will. The orchard itself, the 20 acres everyone had once agreed were fit only for firewood, Josephine restored tree by patient tree over the following seasons, grafting new wood onto old sound rootstock exactly as her aunt had taught her, until it stood once more, within a few years, as one of the finest bearing orchards in the county, its harvest each autumn now shared, in Elijah Holloway's honor and at Josephine's quiet insistence, with any family in the valley who found themselves short. And so it was that Josephine Calder, 40 years old, cast out from her own home by a forged debt and left with less than $5 to her name, became the reason a wronged man's name was finally cleared and a whole valley's oldest, quietest theft was finally set right. The orchard that the county had considered worth nothing more than the $7 she scraped together to buy it had held, beneath its collapsed old well, not merely a stranger's buried coin, but 3 decades of patient, careful truth, waiting only for someone willing to clear away the tangle and look closely at what remained sound beneath it. Josephine had inherited her aunt's old conviction that nothing living, and no truth either, is ever quite as finished as a hurried glance might suggest, and it had cost her everything she had before it finally gave back, not to her alone, but to an entire valley, a debt owed since 1856, and a good name restored to the family who had earned it and never received it. They had called her a fool for paying $7 for a dead orchard. It would turn out that the orchard, and the truth it had been quietly guarding all those years, had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to stop believing it was dead at all. We tell you Josephine's story not merely because a buried ledger and $30 in old gold coin make for a satisfying discovery, though they certainly do, but because of what she chose to do once that discovery was entirely hers to keep or to share. She could have taken the coin quietly, restored her own orchard, and said nothing further of Elijah Holloway's ledger at all, and given everything that had been taken from her. Few in her position could have been blamed for choosing exactly that. Instead, she spent her hard-won evidence clearing a dead man's name and reviving a cooperative fund built to catch neighbors before they fell as far as she herself had fallen, asking nothing for herself beyond the simple return of what had always rightfully been hers. That choice, more than the orchard, more than the ledger, more than the $7 that started it all, is the true inheritance of this story. The understanding that a thing everyone else has agreed to call finished is very often only resting, and that the patient work of looking closely, season after season, is how the overlooked and the wronged alike are finally given the chance to bear fruit again. Before you go, take one final look at Josephine's story. It reminds us that some of life's greatest treasures aren't always hidden beneath the ground. They're hidden beneath years of doubt, neglect, and forgotten hope. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that patience, integrity, and perseverance can reveal miracles long after the world has given up. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered the true value of something everyone else believed was worthless? Or have you ever been underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and your experience could inspire someone else who's quietly holding on to hope. If you enjoy powerful true stories like this, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into remarkable lives, hidden histories, and unforgettable discoveries. Thank you for spending these moments with us. Your time, your support, and your presence mean more than you know. Until our paths cross again, keep believing that sometimes the greatest rewards come to those who refuse to stop looking.